The sick room smelled like disinfectant and cold metal. Underneath that sterile, sharp sting, fainter, lingered the scent of dead ozone from a ventilation unit that hadn't run in months. Empress Valeth of the Velkith Empire sat perfectly upright on the edge of the medical berth. She had not felt warm in 3 years. Protocol dictated that royal recovery chambers be kept at a baseline atmospheric temperature to prevent bacterial growth. It was a clinical, unforgiving chill that had long since settled into her marrow, turning her existence into an endurance test she was quietly failing. Her skin, naturally a rich and vibrant deep purple, was currently marred by spreading patches of ashen gray. The discoloration crept up from her slender wrists, wrapping around her collarbones like frost over a dying garden. Her statuesque, on a 6'3" frame, was held absolutely still. Even her hair, normally a luminous, drifting cloud of silver white, hung flat and dim against her neck. Across the room, resting on a stainless steel medical tray, a small heating stone sat uncharged and ignored. It was standard issue, entirely insufficient for the vastness of the room's engineered winter. Valeth simply stared straight ahead. She was a sovereign drowning in an ocean of ice, her exhaustion so profound it had become a physical weight pressing against her ribs. Every breath required calculation. Every hour was a silent battle against the urge to simply close her eyes and let the gray consume her entirely. Before we witness the crack in the Empress's armor, what happens when an ordinary human stumbles into an empire's deepest secret? Then the reinforced doors slid open. So not for a diplomat, not for a high priest. A human walked in. He was wearing heavy canvas coveralls heavily stained with engine grease, a battered tool belt slung low on his hips, and scuffed work boots that squeaked faintly against the pristine deck plating. He looked about 28, broad-shouldered with tired eyes and a smudge of carbon across his jawline. His work order simply listed Deck 9, Sick Room B. It did not mention that the absolute ruler of 3-star systems was currently occupying it. Elias didn't look at the 2 royal guards standing like statues by the door. He didn't look at the trembling Velkith medic hovering near the diagnostic monitors. He just looked at the wall panel. He was a mechanic. He existed in the invisible lower strata of the station's hierarchy, a ghost who walked through the halls fixing the things the royalty never noticed were broken until they stopped working. He didn't know anything about Velkith biology. He had no idea that the gray spreading across the woman's collarbones meant her body was systematically shutting down. Gray patches spread when hope is lost, a biological white flag that Velkith medics considered a medical impossibility to reverse. Or so they thought. To Elias, she was just another patient in another broken room. A sharp metallic clatter rang out. Elias had dropped his primary spanner. It hit the floor grates with the volume of a gunshot. The 2 royal guards instantly drew their ceremonial energy blades, the weapons humming with lethal intent. Their eyes wide with conditioned panic. Elias just sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. He bent down, unscooped up the heavy wrench, and muttered a quiet apology to the wall panel, completely ignoring the plasma weapons pointed directly at his chest. He slotted his tool into the vent cover and began to unscrew the casing, entirely oblivious to the miniature heart attack he had just given the Imperial Vanguard. He was just doing his job. A mechanic seeing an Empress's gray patches was grounds for reassignment. He saw them. He didn't flinch. That was worse. Beneath the viewport, the shadows lengthened as Elias pulled the heavy ventilation cover free. The internal wiring of the sick room was a mess of degraded copper and blown fuses. He grunted, shifting his weight, and began pulling replacement parts from his belt. As he worked, he dug into his oversized left pocket and pulled out his own personal heating stone. It was chipped, thoroughly used, and currently radiating a steady, comforting heat. He needed both hands for the wiring, so he casually reached over and set the warm stone down on the flat metal armrest of the medical berth. right next to the Empress's frozen hands. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't bow. He just needed a place to set his gear. "Heating's off in here," Elias muttered. He wasn't talking to her. He was talking to the blown fuse bracket in his hand. But the words hung in the sterile air, heavy and undeniable. For 3 years, the Empress had been subjected to the cold. Medics had adjusted her diet, advisors had managed her stress, and guards had secured her perimeter. But no one, not a single soul in the vast apparatus of the Velkith Empire, had simply acknowledged that the room was freezing. Valeth's amethyst eyes slowly shifted from the far wall to the human's broad back. Elias spliced the final wire and pushed the relay back into the bulkhead. The vent hummed to life, a low mechanical purr, and the first faint breath of recycled tepid air pushed into the room. It wasn't enough to combat the deep freeze. Not yet. He turned around to pack up his kit. That was when he finally looked at her. Really looked at her. He saw the way her shoulders were pulled tight, practically curled inward against the chill. He saw the faint tremor in her jaw. He didn't see an Empress. He saw a woman sitting in a medical gown in a room that felt like a meat locker. Elias wiped his hands on a rag, shoved it into his pocket, and unzipped his heavy, grease-stained canvas work jacket. He pulled it off, the thick material holding the deep, irresistible heat of his own body. He took 2 steps forward. He didn't ask. He didn't hesitate. He just reached out and covered her shoulders. Her fingers hadn't moved in 14 seconds. The heating stone rested in her lap. His shadow fell across it. She didn't pull away, which meant the universe was actively unraveling. The heavy canvas settled over her collarbones. It smelled of engine oil, oxidized metal, and the raw, undeniable heat of a living, breathing creature. It was not sterile. It was not protocol. It was overwhelmingly, devastatingly warm. Violet's body reacted before her mind could even process the sheer audacity of the action. She stopped breathing. Her spine, held rigid through 36 months of unyielding royal stoicism, simply gave out. The exhaustion she had been fighting for years violently caught up to her, triggered by the sudden, shocking absence of the cold. She sagged. It was a microscopic movement, a fractional lowering of her posture. But for an Empress of the Velkith, it was the equivalent of a mountain collapsing. The heavy fabric trapped her own failing body heat and pushed the human's lingering warmth directly into her skin. The gray patches along her shoulders, previously numb and deadened, began to tingle with a painful, agonizingly sweet sensation of returning circulation. A single faint pulse of silver light flickered to life in the dim mass of her hair. She didn't speak. She didn't have the breath for it. Her eyes fluttered shut, unable to bear the harsh lighting of the room, while her sensory receptors were being flooded with such profound relief. She leaned back, infinitesimally, into the weight of the jacket. It was dirty, but it was improper. It was the best thing she had felt in 1,000 days. In the corridor outside, a guard stopped breathing. The silence in the sick room had fundamentally changed its texture. It was no longer the empty, hollow quiet of a tomb. It was the held breath of a room where something impossible had just occurred. The 2 Imperial guards by the door stood absolutely paralyzed. Their training dictated that anyone touching the Empress without authorization be immediately subdued. But to subdue the human meant removing the jacket. Removing the jacket meant subjecting their sovereign to the cold she had just visibly surrendered to. Their eyes darted wildly between Elias, who was calmly zipping up his tool bag, and their Empress, whose eyelids were shut in absolute, desperate peace. They did nothing. A sharp, metallic clatter. The royal medic had backed up a single step and dropped his diagnostic data pad. He was staring at the life signs monitor mounted above the berth. The core temperature readings, which had been locked in a slow, steady decline for months, had ticked upward by 1/10 of a degree. And the heating stone. Elias's battered personal heating stone, resting casually on the tray directly beside Valith's left hand, hummed with a quiet, steady rhythm. Her pale, gray-tipped fingers were resting less than an inch from its surface, drawn unconsciously toward the ambient heat. The space between the human and the alien thrummed with a heavy, unspoken weight. Elias swung his tool bag over his shoulder, entirely unaware of the biological and political earthquake he had just triggered. He adjusted his belt, gave a brief, polite nod to the room at large. Ellen turned toward the door. For the first time in 3 years, the Empress did not watch the door close. She kept her eyes shut, pulled the grease-stained canvas tighter around her neck, and finally allowed herself to rest. The heavy canvas jacket was an anchor dropped into a turbulent sea. Valith's chin dropped. The rigid alignment of her cervical spine, maintained through years of agonizing, stoic suffering, finally bowed. The warmth was immediate and localized, seeping through the thin, sterile medical gown and driving directly into the deadened gray patches on her shoulders. It was a suffocatingly crude garment. It smelled of chemical solvents, oxidized copper, and the deep, raw musk of human sweat. It was perfect. She let go. Her silver-white hair, which had been a dull, lifeless ash for 36 months, began to pulse. A single strand caught the harsh overhead light, shimmering with a sudden, bioluminescent glow. Then another. The Valkith fear response, the dimming in the gray, was violently reversing course, battered back by the simple, radiating heat of a stranger's discarded coat. Beside her resting hand, the battered heating stone clicked as its internal thermostat regulated against the chill. She didn't open her eyes. She just shifted her weight, leaning fully into the thick collar, her chest rising and falling in the first deep, untroubled breath she had taken since the war ended. A breath that shook her entire frame. The Royal Medic's life signs monitor spiked wildly. The core temperature graph, a flat line of despair that had defined her existence, angled sharply upward. The two Imperial guards remained absolutely frozen, their plasma blades still drawn but lowered toward the floor, their disciplined minds utterly failing to process the sight of their dying monarch, curling into a mechanic's filthy workwear. Even the silence knew. Every muscle in Valith's back, pulled taut by the relentless freeze of medical protocol, began to unknot. The sensation was almost agonizing in its sheer, unadulterated relief. She simply existed within the pocket of heat he had casually discarded over her skin. The gray had stopped spreading. The medics couldn't explain it. The heating stone on her desk was still warm. It wasn't hers. 3 hours earlier, he was just a mechanic with a wrench. Now the entire biological reality of an Empress was shifting on its axis. The gray patches along her collarbones were actively receding beneath the heavy canvas. The ashen, deadened edges blurred and dissolved, giving way to the rich, flawless, deep purple of healthy Valkith skin, a reversal that was documented as a medical impossibility. The royal medic stood utterly paralyzed in the center of the room, his dropped data pad lying forgotten on the deck plates. Yet right before his eyes, her hair was transforming into a blinding silver white, casting a soft lunar glow against the sterile walls of the sick room. The biology of a sovereign was rewriting itself. Footsteps echoed in the corridor. Heavy, squeaking work boots moving with deliberate, unhurried slowness. Elias reappeared in the doorway. He had realized his tool belt was lighter than it should be. He looked into the room, his dark eyes scanning the space for the chipped heating stone he had left on the tray. He saw the Empress. He saw that her eyes were closed, her breathing finally deep and even, her towering frame huddled completely beneath his oversized, grease-stained jacket. The sick room was no longer a tomb. He didn't know he had just reversed a terminal biological decline. He didn't know he had terrified the royal vanguard into absolute stillness. He merely saw a patient who finally looked comfortable for the first time in her life. "Thought you could use the quiet," He kept his voice low, a rough, matter-of-fact rumble that barely carried across the room. He didn't step back inside to retrieve the stone. He just looked at the resting woman, nodded once to himself, and turned back toward the corridor. Valeth's amethyst eyes snapped open at the exact sound of his voice. She watched his broad, canvas-clad back disappear into the hall. The devastation of that simple, six-word sentence hit her core like a physical strike. He hadn't just given her warmth. He had recognized her exhaustion. She stopped correcting herself. She reached up, gripped the thick canvas collar of his jacket with trembling purple fingers, and pulled it tightly against her cheek. 2 corridors away, Elias was already tapping a mundane update into his datapad. He noted that Sickroom B's ventilation was repaired and that he had left a personal item behind by accident. He would retrieve it tomorrow. He wiped a smudge of hydraulic oil from his forehead, adjusted his tool belt, and kept walking, humming a tuneless song to himself. Back in the sick room, the shift was absolute and irreversible. The High Advisor arrived for the evening briefings, carrying a stack of encrypted data scrolls, prepared for the usual grim, whispered update on the sovereign's failing health, a routine he despised. He stepped through the reinforced doors and stopped dead in his tracks. The Empress of the Valkeith was sitting perfectly upright. Her hair was a blazing corona of silver starlight, illuminating the room with the undeniable biological sign of absolute Valkeith vitality. The gray was entirely gone from her hands, replaced by flawless, unblemished purple skin. And she was wrapped in a human's filthy, oversized maintenance jacket. She didn't take it off when the advisor entered. She didn't offer a single word of explanation for the grease stains pressing against her pristine royal gown. For the first time in 3 years, she simply pointed to a chair with a perfectly steady hand and gestured for the briefing to begin. The authority in her movement was total, completely lacking the brittle fragility that had defined her reign for years. It was already done. The bureaucratic machine of the Empire immediately scrambled to categorize the impossible without admitting what had caused it. The maintenance log for Deck 9 now includes a standing note: do not relocate heating stone from command railing. Authorization: classified above maintenance grade. The royal medic simply stared at his diagnostic monitors, not utterly defeated by the complete upending of his entire medical career. The warmth from the repaired wall unit finally filled the room, mixing with the lingering, localized heat of the small stone resting on the tray. But the Empress did not let go of the jacket. The agonizing fear was gone. The endless cold was gone. The Empire had its sovereign back. And she was wearing canvas. 3 days later, the sick room no longer smelled of dead ozone and despair. The wall unit hummed with a steady, reliable rhythm, maintaining a temperature that was decidedly not standard Valkeith protocol. The heavy canvas jacket had been returned to the maintenance bay through official channels, thoroughly sanitized, chemically treated, and folded with geometric precision by a terrified quartermaster. Within an hour of its return, a formal royal requisition had been filed requesting a replacement jacket of identical make, weight, and material. For the cold, the Empress had stated simply, a command that brooked no argument. No one in the High Council dared question why the sick room was already perfectly heated. It wasn't a choice anymore. Elias's new work order simply listed a malfunctioning light fixture on Deck 9, 3 doors down from Sick Room B. He would walk down that corridor. His heavy boots would squeak against the pristine deck plating. And inside the royal chamber, sitting tall and regal with luminous silver hair spilling over her shoulders, the absolute ruler of 3-star systems would listen for his footsteps. The gray patches had not returned. The medics had entirely stopped running their useless tests, accepting the miracle without understanding the mechanic who caused it, a human with a wrench. On the edge of the medical tray, the battered chipped heating stone sat exactly where Elias had left it. It had been recharged twice, not by the maintenance staff, not by the Royal Guard. by the Empress herself. She plugged it into the wall socket every morning, watching the small indicator light turn green. The stone was still warm. She hadn't needed it in 2 days. She kept it anyway. Not for the heat, but for the hands that left it. If you enjoyed this quiet moment, come back tomorrow. We'll be here with another story from the stars.